They walked unhurried to the far end of the ballroom, where a slight dais held a few ornamental chairs and a podium prepared for the evening's announcement, which everyone had assumed would involve his engagement to one of the eligible daughters present. Likely Lady Margaret Locksley, whose father had all but boasted of the match. The prince did not wait for a herald. He raised one hand, not in command, but to still the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly but without pomp. "Forgive the interruption." The hush that followed was absolute. Even the fire in the grates seemed to soften. "Many of you know me, or rather, the idea of me, and many of you have prepared ambitions based on that idea." He looked out over the room, his gaze unhurried, not cruel, merely honest. "But I have no intention of announcing a betrothal this evening," he said. A gasp fluttered from the Locksley side of the room. A lady dropped her fan. Someone muttered, "Impossible." "I am, however," he continued, "choosing to renew an acquaintance, one that predated titles, court, and obligation." He turned to Clara, and the way he looked at her, not with possession but with memory and intention, sent a visible ripple through the assembly. Her cheeks flushed, but she stood tall. "This is Miss Clara Vale," he said, "daughter of Edward Vale, barrister and former counsel to the Crown. Some of you may remember him, some of you may not. That, I suppose, says more about you than him." A different kind of silence now, one with edge. Clara's name had never been spoken in such company, certainly not by royalty. Lady Eugenia was pale. "She is here tonight," the prince went on, "not by mistake, not by pity, and not because I mistook her for someone else. That was meant for the mutterers, the deniers. She is here because she is the only one in this room who ever saw me without fear or flattery. When I was 12, she gave me half her bread and corrected my Latin." A pause. "She was also the first to tell me I was not clever, and that if I wanted to earn respect, I must first stop expecting it." There were no smiles now, not even the faint kind. And then, as if on cue, the butler, rigid and confused, stepped forward with a sealed envelope. He whispered, "This was delivered an hour ago, sir, marked private for the prince's hand only." Clara glanced at the seal. She recognized it. Mr. Manners had written it. The prince broke it open. He read silently, then looked up. "This letter," he said, raising it, "contains 3 names. All of them belong to men present in this room, all of whom orchestrated the financial ruin and social exile of Mr. Edward Vale, so that their own misdealings might remain hidden." He did not shout. He didn't need to. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else took a step back. "Perhaps later," he said calmly, "we shall read it aloud." Then he folded it neatly and returned it to his coat. "Tonight," he added, "is for dancing." And with that, he turned to Clara. "Shall we?" he asked, offering his arm again. She hesitated only a breath, then nodded. And the orchestra, uncertain but obedient, began to play again. The room, however, did not move, because everything had changed. The tremor beneath the ballroom's marble calm began with the smallest crack. A cough, then a chair scraped hastily across the floor. But it spread quickly, like frost over glass, reaching even the highest collars and the most seasoned expressions of practiced nobility. Lord Peregrine of Leicester whispered something sharp into his wife's ear and moved toward the exit, though he made an effort not to appear hurried. Lady Margaret Locksley stood rooted, her lips parted, fingers stiff on the fan she no longer fluttered. Her mother gripped her arm, eyes darting from Clara to the prince as if deciding which was the more dangerous apparition. And Lady Eugenia Vale. She stepped forward, not quickly, not angrily, but with the composure of a woman who had been publicly dressed in her own humiliation and refused to show the stain. "Your Highness," she said, each word cut from marble, "I trust you do not mean to shame this family by entertaining the company of a ward who has been raised under my roof by charity and grace." Clara did not flinch. The prince turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "I do not shame your family, Lady Eugenia," he replied. "I merely correct the record." The gathered lords and ladies watched with the breathless attention of a court without a judge. She was not raised by charity, he continued. She was kept under your roof as a debt owed to her father, whose reputation you allowed to be shattered so your own name might escape scandal. A murmur passed through the crowd. The word debt was not one these people liked. I have done no such, Lady Eugenia began, but the prince raised a single hand. It is not you I intend to indict, he said with controlled calm. Not publicly, not yet, but I have letters and sworn statements, and your name appears in all three. Lady Eugenia's face lost all its color. And if this is to become a battle of records, he added, let us ensure all the ledgers are brought to light. For a long, uncomfortable pause, she said nothing. Her eyes flicked to Clara, not in fear, but in disbelief, as if only now seeing the shape her ward had taken. You presume, she said tightly, that breeding can be replaced by memory. No, Clara said softly, stepping forward at last, voice steady and controlled. He presumes that integrity still has value. Her voice was not loud, but it reached them all, for it was not simply a challenge, it was an indictment, and that voice, which they had ignored at supper tables, which they had silenced with lace and obligation, was now measured and unflinching. Miss Vale, said Mr. Alden Farley, stepping forward with the expression of a man about to make a final, desperate play. Let us not mistake attention for admiration. His Highness is being generous. No, said the prince, turning fully to face him now. You mistake amusement for civility. You mistake cruelty for wit, and you mistake silence for absence. Alden flushed red, and Clara saw the exact moment when the measure of a man began to shrink before the room that once applauded him. I dare say, Alden said, lips twisting, you have just made quite the spectacle of a girl who has nothing to offer your future. But the prince only looked at Clara and said, she has already given it meaning, and that turned the final ripple into a wave. From the far end of the room, Mr. Hartley Manners stepped forward. A humble man, greying, with documents in hand. He cleared his throat. If I may, Your Highness, he said respectfully, then turned to Lady Eugenia. I have with me 3 codicils, one signed by Edward Vale, one by the Lord Chancellor, and one most recently by His Highness, confirming that Miss Clara Vale is not only the sole beneficiary of her father's remaining holdings, but also the rightful claimant to property withheld through unlawful coercion. Lady Eugenia's mouth opened, but she said nothing, because the third document, the one held gently but deliberately in Mr. Manners' hand, bore the seal of the crown. And in that moment, the laughter from earlier in the night became a ghost, haunting the corners of the room. No one dared speak, because the invisible girl had become the one name they could not erase, and the dance was only just beginning. As the paper in Mr. Manners' hand caught the firelight, the weight of silence in the room deepened into something rawer, not reverence, not fear, but recognition. The kind that shifts the atmosphere when truth is spoken too clearly for anyone to pretend they didn't hear it. Lady Eugenia faltered. Her chin, always so elegantly poised, trembled for the first time, and for a brief, unguarded instant, the years melted off her face. She looked not like a lady of social precision, but like a woman whose world had begun to unravel thread by thread, not in the shadows, but before an audience that mattered. I gave her everything, she whispered, eyes glassy and unfocused. I gave her a roof, a name. You gave her the corners of rooms, Clara replied, gently but firmly. You gave her silence and shame wrapped in linen. There was no venom in her voice, only exhaustion and truth. Mr. Farley, emboldened by Eugenia's collapse, stepped toward Clara again, his tone growing desperate. You're not one of us, he spat. You're a girl who knew the right name to drop. You belong in the servants' passage, not beside a prince. Clara turned to him, eyes clear. I was in the passage, she said. I listened to all of you speak as if your titles made you clever. But servants hear everything. We are the witnesses to your undoing. The prince did not speak. He didn't need to. He merely stood behind Clara, his presence as still and certain as a bell tower at dusk. In the far corner of the room, Lady Margaret Locksley burst into tears. Not dainty, pretty tears, but an unguarded sob, sharp and sudden. She had spent 3 seasons preparing to be chosen, rehearsing bows, perfecting glances, wearing her mother's jewels as bait rather than heirlooms. And now she was watching her carefully choreographed triumph vanish into a lavender gown stitched from drapes. Her mother tried to comfort her, but Lady Margaret tore away, her sob echoing off the ceiling before she fled the ballroom. Several others followed. Clara stood amidst the ruin she had not planned, the justice she had not imagined would come so swiftly. And though she did not cry, not yet, something in her shifted. It was not victory. It was something lonelier. The moment after a storm clears, when the land is quiet not from peace, but from shock. "Miss Vale," said a young debutante barely older than 16, approaching with trembling hands. I just wanted to say—" She paused, unable to finish, then curtsied, deeper than etiquette required. Clara blinked, not in confusion, but in something close to sorrow, because she knew what this meant, that they would all start watching her now, listening, mimicking, seeking favor. She had become a new center, and she had spent her entire life in the margins. The prince, as if sensing her thought, leaned slightly toward her. "I'll not let them make a spectacle of you," he said, his voice low. "Not if I can help it." She looked at him. "Can you?" He hesitated. "Perhaps not forever," he admitted, "but long enough for you to decide what comes next." That honesty, that absence of pomp, was what made her believe him. And yet behind them, the rustle of movement continued. Lady Eugenia had not left. She stood still, as if chained to the floor, her eyes fixed not on Clara, but on the letter Mr. Manners still held. She knew what was in it. Clara knew it too. But the time for readings had not yet come, only the time for reckoning. And in that slow, seismic moment, all the daughters, all the dowagers, all the polished gentlemen of fortune realized this night would not be remembered for gowns or gossip. It would be remembered for the girl who was not invited, and became the story no one could stop. Clara did not speak again for some time. The room seemed to vibrate with unspoken thoughts, but no one dared break the silence she had left in her wake. Her very presence, that of a girl no one had deemed worthy of note just hours before, had become heavier than gold, more disruptive than scandal. The prince, still beside her, did not touch her again, nor guide her. He merely stood as if to say, "Let them look, let them learn." Lady Eugenia swayed slightly where she stood. A chair was offered. She refused it with the pride of a woman who would rather fall than sit in defeat. Her eyes were glassy, but her posture was rigid. One could not accuse her of weeping. Not yet. Clara turned to her slowly. She had spent years avoiding that gaze, years contorting herself to fit the shrinking space Eugenia offered. But now she returned it, not cruelly, not triumphantly, but with a quiet certainty that made everyone watching forget to breathe. "I will leave your house tonight," Clara said, her voice low but unwavering. "Not with bitterness, but with the knowledge I never belonged there." "You were nothing when I took you in," Eugenia hissed, the tightness of her throat distorting her words. "No," Clara said, "I was everything. You just couldn't see it." A pause. Then she added with a calm that felt like winter settling over a field, "But he did." She didn't look at the prince when she said it. She didn't need to. The footmen near the back, who had long since stopped pretending to be invisible, exchanged glances. One of them, young, freckled, subtly nudged the other. They had known Clara long before anyone here remembered her name, and they stood a little straighter now. The orchestra, uncertain, attempted to begin a gavotte, but the energy was gone. No one stepped forward. Dancers who had spent hours being coiffed and arranged now hovered in corners like ghosts displaced from their own reflection. "I should call for your carriage," Lady Eugenia muttered. "No," said the prince, his voice firm but not unkind. "I've already sent for mine." Lady Eugenia's lips twitched, but she did not speak again. Instead, she turned, gathered her skirts like armor, and walked from the room. Not a soul followed her. Clara inhaled slowly. The scent of roses, beeswax, and candle smoke filled her lungs. She had spent so long fearing this moment. Not the confrontation, but the after. The scent of orange blossoms clung to the velvet air like a memory that refused to be forgotten. Candlelight flickered against the golden friezes of the palace chapel, each flame bowing faintly, as if in deference to the magnitude of the occasion. Beneath the domed ceiling, embroidered with cherubs and judgmental saints, a gathering of England's most illustrious bloodlines whispered behind lace fans and gilded opera glasses. All eyes, however, were drawn to the altar. Prince Alaric of Glenshire, tall, glacial, unnervingly composed, stood with the poise of a man bred for duty. His uniform was a tapestry of medals, silver thread epaulets, and a sword that had never tasted war. Next to him, draped in pale blue satin, the Marchioness Eleanor of Tavistones trembled not from nerves, but from triumph. Her gown sparkled like frost at dawn, and her smile, carefully rehearsed, was as flawless as the diamonds braided into her coiffure. In the third row, behind a row of silk-gloved nobility, sat a figure that did not belong. Clara Wetherell, a palace maid, her apron perfectly pressed, her eyes far too composed for her station, knelt at the edge of the pew. Her presence was permitted only by the fact that she had served the royal household since she was 11, and had long ago mastered the art of being invisible. No one addressed her, though she had carried Eleanor's letters, fetched Alaric's forgotten gloves, and once stitched a gash in his uniform the morning before Parliament. They did not know that she had once stood barefoot in the prince's study, trembling, a letter clutched in her ink-stained hands, a letter she never sent. The Archbishop's voice rose, echoing through the nave. "If any person here present knows of any lawful impediment, why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony." It was a sentence all knew by heart, a sentence never meant to be fulfilled, and yet. Clara's fingers gripped the wooden pew. A single movement, nearly imperceptible, rippled through her. A breath in, a breath out. The chapel, until now saturated with the rustle of silk and murmurs of awe, fell into a hush so absolute it was as though the very walls leaned in to listen. She stood, not with hesitation nor with theatrics, simply as if the act had been delayed long enough. Heads turned, eyebrows rose. A fan snapped shut with a crisp, offended click. At the altar, Prince Alaric turned as well, not with surprise, but with something colder, something older. And Clara spoke, but not yet in words. She opened her hand. In it, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a broken emblem, the private insignia of the House of Glenshire. The Marchioness's smile faltered, as if she'd felt a draught in a room sealed for winter. And the silence deepened. Something had shifted. How a thread pulled taut through time had just begun to unravel, and none of them, not the Archbishop, not the bride, not even the prince, knew how far it would fall. Clara lowered her hand, but her eyes never left Alaric's, and he, for the first time in years, looked away first. Whispers crawled along the marble like insects scuttling under chandeliers. Lady Fenwick gasped into her fan. Viscount Hargrove's monocle dropped noiselessly onto his waistcoat. The Dowager Countess of Dunley, who hadn't spoken since the Queen's last birthday garden party, muttered, "A servant," with such disdain that even the altar candles seemed to flicker in response. But the silence that followed Clara's interruption was not a startled one. It was lethal. The Archbishop cleared his throat once, twice, the second time more like a warning than a cough, and glanced uneasily at the prince. Helena turned toward Alaric, expecting him to laugh it off, to restore the moment with some cutting remark that would place the girl back into obscurity where she belonged. That was, after all, what noblemen were taught to do. But Alaric said nothing. He merely stared at Clara, as though he had expected this and or feared it. Clara remained standing, her back straight, her hand still holding the crumpled parchment. Her face was pale, but her gaze, wide, unblinking, steady, defied every rule she had learned below stairs. Servants did not stand during ceremonies. They did not interrupt royalty. They did not speak. And yet, she was not escorted out. A guard shifted uneasily near the back wall but made no move toward her. The room, golden and suffocating, was still, as though trapped inside the very moment of a sword being unsheathed. At last, Eleanor took a step forward. "What is this?" Her voice was high, pleasant, too controlled, the pitch of a woman raised on performance. "If this is some melodrama, I'm afraid you've mistaken your place, miss." Clara blinked slowly. "I know my place, my lady." The words were soft, painfully soft in a room meant for fanfare and proclamations, but their quiet was precisely what gave them weight. They landed like stones in crystal. Eleanor's smile began to fray, then kindly returned to it. "This is neither your moment nor your concern." But Clara did not sit. Instead, she turned her gaze, slow and deliberate, to the prince. "Is it not, Your Highness?" she asked. And in that instant, the way she said it, not as a servant, not as a subject, but as someone who knew him, cracked something no one else in the room could see. Eleanor flushed. "Alaric, say something. This is your wedding day." He still did not speak. Instead, he glanced at the letter in Clara's hand, and that one look was more dangerous than a confession, because it meant he recognized it. The letter, the one written in his hand, bearing his seal, long thought destroyed, was real. And if that letter was real, then so was everything in it. Eleanor staggered back half a step, catching herself with one gloved hand on the altar rail. Lady Fenwick whispered again, this time louder, "She's not just a servant." Gasps followed. Someone stood, a cousin, a baron, it didn't matter. The rouse stirred, suddenly eager, scandal blooming like frost rot on ripe fruit. The tension was no longer subtle. It had broken surface, and now it hung, rippling, as if the entire palace held its breath beneath a rising tide. The Archbishop looked again to the prince. "Your Highness, shall we proceed?" But the question rang absurd now, hollow, already obsolete, because the bride's hand no longer rested in the prince's, and the servant had not been removed. Clara remained, still standing, still silent, still holding the parchment that threatened to drag this wedding, and every name attached to it, into a storm far older than the flowers in Eleanor's hair. And in the farthest corner, near the choir alcove, someone whispered, "She loved him first." Before the palace, before the letter, before she learned to braid Eleanor's hair in perfect Grecian knots and smile without showing her teeth, Clara Wetherell had been no one. Just the daughter of a governess and a stable groom, orphaned in a wet spring, placed in service at Glenshire Palace because the housekeeper owed her mother a kindness. She was 11 then, thin as a birch rod, with hands too quick for her own good, and eyes that memorized things she wasn't supposed to notice. She learned the palace by rhythm, the groan of the east staircase, the creak behind the linen closet, the precise number of steps from the servants' entrance to the state drawing room. She moved like breath through a flute, heard only when wanted, never otherwise. And then she saw him. Alaric was 17, golden, distant, and dressed for mourning. His mother had just died. The Queen Consort's funeral had blanketed the palace in black and forced even the maids to iron their aprons with extra starch. Clara remembered watching him through the keyhole as he stood alone beside the window of the Red Gallery, eyes fixed on the courtyard where the cortege had just disappeared. He didn't cry, he didn't move, but something in his stillness broke her. It was the stillness of someone who had never been comforted properly. He never saw her. Not then, but 5 years later he did. It was winter. Clara was 16, no longer invisible, but still unnoticed. She had been sent to deliver a pair of gloves to his study, gloves he had misplaced before a royal engagement. When she arrived, he was seated at the hearth, a book open in his lap, his cravat undone, a rare sight. He looked up and said, "You read, don't you?" She nearly dropped the gloves. "What, my lord?" "You're the one who alphabetized the library servant's shelf." "I noticed." She swallowed. "I only meant to help Miss Fairley find her psalms more easily." He stood, closed the book, and offered it to her. "Keep it. I've read it 3 times." It was The Sorrows of Young Werther. She read it in 3 nights and returned it silently. He never mentioned it again. But from then on, their silences changed. There were glances, accidental overlaps in the corridor. One summer evening, she found herself standing beside him in the rose arbor, called there to collect Eleanor's forgotten gloves again. Always gloves, always some excuse to draw near. They spoke for 10 minutes about a poem by Keats. He remembered her opinion. He quoted it later at dinner. Clara heard it through the service door and pressed her hand against her chest to keep the ache inside. Then, the letter, written in his own hand, sealed with his private crest. Delivered not to her room, but slipped between the pages of a ledger she'd been sent to dust. A reckless, dangerous thing to do, but he had done it. Inside, a confession. No flourishes, no signature. I cannot breathe in this life they have chosen for me. I think of you more than I dare admit. I am not asking for your heart, only your truth. Have I already lost it? She read it 12 times. Then she burned it, or meant to. But the ash stayed whole. The seal refused to vanish, and she kept it, pressed into a prayer book, carried with her each time she entered the chapel, as if God might one day answer what the prince never dared to ask again. But he never spoke of it. Not once. Instead, he courted Eleanor of Tavistown, elegant, entitled, chosen by the Queen. Clara retreated. She did not cry. She did not write. But she watched the courtship unfold, watched Eleanor sweep into the rooms Clara cleaned, heard her boast of favors, of dances, of whispers at moonlit gates, and still the prince said nothing. He had written the words, but he had never spoken them. So Clara had waited, not to be chosen, only to be acknowledged. And now, here, beneath painted cherubs and ancestral judgment, he could no longer pretend he had never written the letter, because she had not burned it. She had brought it with her, and she had stood. And now the silence was his to answer. The letter had lain beneath her pillow for nearly 2 years, folded thrice, pressed flat, carried through the dust and heat of the palace's servants' quarters like a secret heartbeat. Clara never reread it aloud after the first night, but she knew every line as if etched into her bones. She had not meant to keep it. She had not dared to hope it would ever matter. But hope once planted does not always die when ignored. Sometimes it waits. It was the announcement of the engagement that reawakened her resolve. Posted on the grand bulletin board in the marble hall, right above the notice for changes in dinner service, and next to the Queen's invitation list for the Whitsun ball. In golden ink, His Royal Highness Prince Alaric of Glenshire shall wed Lady Eleanor Catherine of Tavistown by the grace and approval of Her Majesty the Queen in the spring of this year. There was applause, smiles, the cooks made cake, even the footmen trimmed their coats. Clara stood in the shadow of the grand staircase and felt a strange absence inside her, as if something essential had been quietly lifted from her body without consent. That night she did not cry, but she unlocked the box beneath her bed. Inside was the parchment still bearing the broken seal. She touched it as one might touch a grave. She thought then of burning it for good, but a knock on her door stopped her. It was Daniel, stable boy turned footman, and one of the few who knew her before she grew into silence. He held a letter in his hand, a fresh one, unsigned, but bearing the same seal. He left this at the stables, Daniel said. Told the coachman to have it sent by courier, but the fool dropped it, thinking it unimportant. I saw the crest. Clara opened it slowly, but her hands did not shake. Inside, orders for a solicitor in Oxford, instructions for a quiet transfer of funds, and a note. She does not know the truth. She must never know, not until I have secured it. It was addressed not to Clara, but about Eleanor, and it confirmed everything she feared, that the prince's heart was buried. That lies were currency, that she had been erased from the page but not from the margins. The next day, Clara went to the housekeeper and requested her first afternoon off in over a year. She went straight to the offices of Mr. Quentin Dorsey, solicitor. He had known her mother once, had come to their cottage when she was 5 and given her a tin soldier carved from ivory. "You've grown," he said, squinting through spectacles. "And you've brought me a royal mess, haven't you?" She laid the 2 letters before him, one of affection, one of betrayal. "I need them sealed, copied, and preserved," she said, quietly, but with a record that cannot be denied. Dorsey took them without question. "You'll need a witness." "I have one," she replied. Daniel, waiting outside, would sign anything she asked. From that day on, Clara's work resumed. No one noticed the change, how she moved with quieter purpose. How she began observing the palace chaplain's schedule, how she memorized the seating for the wedding, how she slipped questions to footmen about the guest list, the order of ceremony, the presence of press. She requested to assist with the wedding preparations, not for the gowns or the flowers, but for the chapel. Her hand touched the very altar on which Eleanor would stand. She laid the runner across the marble tiles. She folded the page boy's cravat. And in her pocket always was the envelope, the one the prince thought forgotten. A week before the ceremony, Clara visited Mr. Darcy once more. "If I do this," she asked, "will you protect me from the Queen's court?" He leaned back in his chair. "Not completely, but I will make it loud enough that they can't bury it. Then seal the documents," she said, "and prepare a second copy, for when I speak." The solicitor blinked. "You mean to speak?" "I mean," Clara said, standing tall for the first time in his office, "to be heard." By the morning of the wedding, her plan was complete. The letter rested beneath her bodice, tied with silk. The copied versions were already in Mr. Darcy's hands. Daniel waited in the carriage yard with instructions. All that remained was one moment, one question asked aloud, and one truth the palace had never prepared for. It began not with Clara's voice, but with a gesture. The letter in her hand, still folded, still trembling slightly in the heat of the chapel's hush, seemed suddenly heavier than the marble floors beneath her feet. For a moment, one blink, it seemed she might falter. But then she stepped forward. 3 paces, measured. Not toward the altar, but toward the center aisle. The noble guests shifted like deer sensing an oncoming storm. The Duke of Trellingham stood half up, uncertain whether to intervene or observe. The Marchioness Eleanor turned fully toward Clara, pale as her bodice pearls. And Alaric did not move. "I beg forgiveness," Clara began, her voice clear, soft, unhurried, "for speaking in a place not meant for voices like mine." The Archbishop opened his mouth, likely to object, but the prince held up a hand. "No," Alaric said. One word. It echoed through the gilded arches like a crack of thunder. "She may speak." And that was it. No guards moved, no protest followed. The Queen's envoy, seated just behind the choir, narrowed his eyes but remained silent. For in that instant Prince Alaric made it law. By decree or by weakness, it did not matter. Clara unfolded the letter slowly. "This was written by His Royal Highness," she said, turning slightly to face the congregation. "2 years ago, and meant only for me." Gasps. "Written not out of duty, nor command, nor arrangement," she continued, "but from feeling." Eleanor's hand gripped the altar rail, white-knuckled. "This is madness." But Clara was not looking at her. She read aloud, "I cannot breathe in this life they have chosen for me. I think of you more than I dare admit. I am not asking for your heart, only your truth. Have I already lost it?" Each line landed like a stone in glass. A low murmuring swept the guests, scandal spreading like smoke. The Marchioness's face hardened, but behind her polished composure, panic bloomed. Clara folded the letter once more. "I speak not because I was chosen," she said, "but because I was promised." A flicker passed across Alaric's face, not fear, but recognition, as if, at last, he saw the weight of his silence given shape. Eleanor turned sharply toward him. "You wrote that?" Her voice cracked in a way no silk could conceal. "You?" He didn't answer. Instead, Clara lifted a second sheet of paper, not aged like the first, but sharp and fresh. "This is a copy of the prince's instructions to his solicitor," she said, now facing the Archbishop. "Sent to Oxford 3 months after his letter to me, ordering the concealment of a previous affection, meant to ensure Lady Eleanor's placement." The Archbishop recoiled. "My child, this is not the place, it is the only place," she said, "and the only moment." Then she turned to Eleanor. "You were not chosen freely," Clara said. "You were selected because it was convenient, because your father secured his debts, because the truth would ruin too many reputations." "You insolent," Eleanor began, but the voice broke again, this time into silence. A commotion began at the rear of the chapel. Mr. Quentin Darcy had arrived, not invited, but summoned by Clara's second message that morning. He carried a satchel, and from it he withdrew sealed documents, and a red-bound record of correspondence. "This," he declared, handing it to the Archbishop, "is a legally witnessed affidavit. It contains copies of letters, financial transactions, and testimony from 2 palace servants. It confirms that the prince's engagement was negotiated under the assumption that no prior bond existed, which, as you see, is untrue." The room burst into chaos. Ladies shrieked softly behind gloved fingers. Lords muttered to one another. The Dowager Countess of Dunlay dropped her prayer book. Alaric did not move, and that was the most damning thing of all. He did not deny it, did not deny her. The Marchioness's lip trembled. "You let me parade before the Queen. You let me plan this farce of a day." Her voice rose, frantic now. "You used me." And still Alaric remained still. "I asked for truth," Clara said softly. "That is all I ever asked." And at last Alaric spoke. "Then you shall have it." But no one knew which of them he meant. "No," Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and high and quivering at the edges. "This cannot be permitted." The spell of silence shattered as the Marchioness stepped forward, her satin skirts trailing like wounded dignity behind her. "She is lying," she said, to no one and everyone. "She's clearly lying. That letter could have been forged. She jabbed a trembling finger toward Clara. "You are nothing but a servant, a grasping, lovesick maid with fantasies far above your station." But no one moved to silence Clara, and worse, no one moved to defend Eleanor. Mr. Darcy, calm as a man dusting bookshelves, stepped to the Archbishop's side. "The documents have been verified, my lord. I am prepared to present the notarized originals to the Chancellor's office by sundown." "On whose authority?" Eleanor demanded, her voice cracking. Darcy turned toward her with unshaken grace. "On the authority of the Duke of Wexley, who witnessed the financial guarantees made to your father in exchange for silence, and whose written statement is included in this file." The name struck the chapel like lightning. The Duke of Wexley, Eleanor's uncle by marriage, seated 2 rows behind the Queen's envoy, went visibly grey. "You what?" he hissed, rising. The rows turned to him. Lady Fenwick stifled a scream. Gasps burst from both wings of the pews, and someone dropped a fan that clattered across the marble. "You signed your name to this?" Eleanor spun toward her uncle. "You knew? I thought it was to protect you," Wexley snapped, his voice cutting across the whispers. "I thought the girl had been dismissed, not kept under your nose like some ghost haunting his memory." Clara said nothing. She hadn't expected allies. She hadn't needed them. Eleanor trembled. "She means to disgrace us. She means to undo everything." The Queen's envoy finally rose. "There are truths that, when uncovered, must be addressed, regardless of the embarrassment they cause. The prince's signature is valid, and the law, Marchioness, does not recognize rank when deceit is proven." "I am not Marchioness yet," Eleanor spat. A pause, cold, final. "Indeed," the envoy said coolly, "you are not." The Archbishop folded his hands slowly and turned to Prince Alaric. "Your Highness, shall I proceed with the vows?" The question hung like a gallows rope in a still wind. Clara did not look at Alaric. She didn't need to. Her eyes stayed on the parchment in her hand, her knuckles white with resolve. Alaric turned, slowly, and met her gaze. And in front of God, royalty, and the unforgiving stone of Glenshire's ancient chapel, he said, "No." The refusal fell with the weight of final judgment. Eleanor stumbled back a full step. Her mother, from the front row, half rose, her face like paper ash. "Alaric," she whispered, "think of the crown." But the prince had already made his choice. "Think of your mother's memory," the Dowager Countess tried. "I am," he said quietly. And that too was a blow none could parry. Eleanor's composure, crafted from years of flattery and social conquest, collapsed. "You would throw this away? Her voice broke. "For a letter?" "No," he said, softer than before. "For the truth." Clara did not weep. She did not smile. She only stood there, still trembling, still upright, like a tree that refused to be felled in a storm. And though the room was filled with power, pedigree, and legacy, no one looked at Eleanor anymore. They looked at Clara, the girl who spoke. and brought the walls down with her. The silence that followed was not triumphant. It was heavy, like the air before thunder, full of something unfinished and unspeakably human. The chapel, with its stained glass saints and suffocating opulence, became a room of reckoning. Eleanor stood frozen, her chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths, as if her corset were made not of whalebone but wire. Her voice, when it returned, was not the polished lilt of a noble bride, but something jagged. "You have humiliated me," she whispered, not to Alaric, but to no one, and everyone. "In front of the Queen's envoy, in front of my family. I was meant to be her grace, not discarded." No one replied. Her uncle, the Duke of Wexley, had turned his face away. Her mother looked at the floor. The guests, once ravenous for spectacle, now averted their eyes, unable to bear the sting of watching a woman unravel with no mask left to wear. Eleanor turned to Clara, eyes blazing. "You did this for revenge, didn't you? You were jealous. You couldn't bear to be left behind." Clara's voice was quiet. "I would have let you marry him if he had never written to me." "But he did," Eleanor snapped. Clara nodded. "Yes, and you deserve to know it. As do I." The Marchioness's lower lip trembled. For the first time, her beauty looked brittle. "You've ruined me," she said. But it was not true. Clara had not ruined her. The lie had. Alaric spoke, but not to Clara, not to Eleanor, to the air, to the judgment in the chapel, to the eyes watching from painted portraits above. "I never intended to hurt either of you," he said, voice low. "But I did." Clara closed her eyes. That was the only apology she would receive, and the only one she had needed. Eleanor made no move to stay. She stepped down from the altar, her skirts brushing the embroidered aisle runner, her steps faltering only once. No one reached to assist her, no hand was offered, no arm extended. The grand bride exited the chapel as a shadow. The doors opened for her with a creak, then closed behind her with finality. Inside, the guests sat motionless. The Archbishop cleared his throat. "Shall we adjourn the ceremony?" There was no response. Even the musicians in the choir loft did not stir. The Queen's envoy gathered the documents from Mr. Darcy with careful hands and said nothing, only nodding to the prince as he passed. He knew what this meant. The court would not be silent. The press would feast. The Queen would rage. But the truth, once spoken aloud in a sacred room, could not be unsaid. Prince Alaric descended the steps from the altar and stood before Clara. They were close now, for the first time, equals by proximity, but not by standing. She did not curtsy. He did not bow. He looked at her, and though the silence between them was thick with history, with hurt, it held no hatred. "I thought I could bury it," he said. "I tried." Clara nodded. "I know. You never meant to ruin me." "No," she said, "but I did mean to remind you." The words settled between them like ash after fire. He reached for her hand but did not touch it. He simply asked, "What do you want now?" Clara looked past him, at the guests, at the chapel, at the path she had just altered, and then she said simply, "To leave. Not in flight, not in shame, but in peace." Alaric stepped aside, and Clara, no longer a servant, no longer a secret, walked past him. The doors did not creak for her. They opened as if they had been waiting. The corridor beyond the chapel was colder than Clara remembered, a draught echoing through its high arches, like the breath of the old palace itself. She had walked this hallway 100 times before, always silent, always unnoticed, her apron just grazing the stone, her presence as invisible as the ghosts the housemaids whispered about. But today, each step rang, not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly, with the sound of finality. Behind her, the murmurs resumed, not whispers anymore, but voices heavy with consequence, lords asking questions no one could answer, ladies leaning in to reassure one another they had known something was amiss, that they had always suspected, and Prince Alaric still standing at the foot of the altar, watching her go. He did not follow. He could not. To do so would be to abandon everything: title, inheritance, duty. And Clara did not ask it of him. She had never wanted his ruin, only his recognition, and now that it was hers, she did not look back. Daniel was waiting in the palace courtyard, pacing beside the small, hired carriage with its plain wheels and worn brass lanterns. When he saw her, he exhaled and stepped forward. "It's done then?" he asked, his voice hushed in awe more than disbelief. Clara nodded. "Yes." He opened the carriage door without flourish. "Where to?" She hesitated, one hand on the doorframe. "To Oxford," she said, "for now." "Will you return?" Clara looked up at the sky, pale, cloudless, heartlessly blue, only as a guest. With that, she stepped into the carriage. As it pulled away, the palace grew smaller behind her. Its spires, its carvings, its windows, that had once reflected her shadow but never her name. It did not feel like loss. It felt like a season ending. A chapter closed not with a death, but with a decision. Inside the chapel, Alaric remained standing for several minutes after her departure. The archbishop had long since left the dais. The guests filtered out with the slow shuffle of scandal-wounded pride. The choir boys had ceased their silent vigil, returning to the cloisters to murmur the story into corners that would carry it for generations. He stood alone. No crown, no bride, no vows spoken. Just a man surrounded by the cost of silence. Later that day, a page delivered a sealed packet to his study, the original letter, along with Clara's quiet handwriting on a single slip of parchment. "You asked if you had already lost it. Now you know, but that is not the same as being unloved." No signature. None was needed. By dusk, the royal engagement had been annulled. Lady Eleanor had left for her family estate in Wiltshire. Rumours bloomed, some vicious, others sympathetic, all impossible to silence. Servants were dismissed. Invitations withdrawn. The palace licked its wounds behind damask curtains and denied everything aloud, while whispering it twice as hard behind closed doors. And Clara? She arrived in Oxford that night with one trunk, 3 dresses, and the recommendation of Mr. Dorsey in her satchel. By morning, she would begin work at a local registry office, copying legal documents, transcribing testimony. She would live quietly, but not invisibly. Never again. 3 days after the wedding that was not, Glenshire Palace reopened its doors only to those with the thickest titles and the shortest memories. Florists were turned away. The chapel was locked. The banquet hall, once dressed for celebration, stood hollow, the scent of sugared almonds still clinging to the draperies like the remnants of a dream no one dared name. The Queen's envoy departed in silence, bearing with him sealed reports that would be combed through by Parliament, quietly, discreetly, for the Crown could not afford another scandal so soon after the Camberley inheritance dispute. The public, of course, received only a polished notice in the Times. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the nuptials of His Royal Highness Prince Alaric of Glenshire and Lady Eleanor of Tavistock have been indefinitely postponed. Postponed, a word that masked 1,000 truths, one that satisfied no one and explained even less. Eleanor, sequestered at her family's estate in Wiltshire, refused visitors. Her mother, once known for her tireless ambition and cutting remarks at court, now answered invitations with only 2 words: not attending. Her gowns were packed away. Her name faded from the tongues of debutantes and matchmakers. It was said she took to walking the gardens alone at dusk, her gloves still pearl white, though she never wore them now. As for Alaric, he resumed his duties with mechanical precision: military reviews, charity appearances, and long hours in the parliamentary gallery. But the sparkle that once drew admiration had dulled. He no longer lingered in conversation, no longer danced at court. He carried himself as if he were always leaving a funeral, though no bells had rung. Behind closed doors, 2 footmen were dismissed without references. One housekeeper received a generous pension, though no one quite knew why. And Lady Fenwick's niece, once betrothed to a minor viscount, was suddenly sent to France to recover her spirits. But the most striking absence was the simplest. Clara Wetherell's name was removed from the household register. The chambermaid who replaced her found no personal effects, no notes, not even a hairpin left behind. It was as if she had been erased, and yet not forgotten. Once, during a formal luncheon, a visiting duchess made mention of the wedding incident in hushed tones, giggling behind a gloved hand. Alaric, overhearing, said nothing. He merely excused himself from the table and did not return. At the spring equinox, the chapel's carpets were replaced. The marble floor beneath the altar was polished. The letter, the one Clara had read aloud, was never discussed again. But the palace remembered. Maids told stories in whispers, pausing every time they crossed the threshold of the chapel. They said if you listened closely, you could still hear the echo of her voice in the stone. In Oxford, Clara settled into a rhythm. She lived in a modest terraced house above the bookshop. The window overlooked the college green, and every morning she brewed tea with lavender and wrote letters she never posted. Her work at the registry office brought her into quiet proximity with lives in flux, births, deaths, marriages. She understood them all more than most. Each document she copied was another thread in a tapestry she was no longer trying to escape, only to understand. She did not speak of Alaric. But once, while signing a ledger for a widow in mourning, the woman paused and looked at her with sudden clarity. "You're the one," she said softly, "from Glenshire, the chapel." Clara met her eyes and smiled. "Not anymore," she replied gently. But when she walked home that night, the wind caught the edge of her coat just enough to reveal the faintest fold of parchment tucked near her chest. She hadn't let it go. Not fully. Not yet. The path behind the registry office wound along the Cherwell River, past a cluster of weeping willows that leaned toward the water as if listening to their own reflections. Clara walked there every evening, her footsteps muffled by moss and memory, her coat pulled close even in warm weather. Oxford was kind in its forgetfulness, a city full of people too busy thinking to ask too many questions. She liked it that way. In the window of the bookshop below her lodging, a small brass placard had been placed, "Clara Wetherell, Legal Transcription Services." It was modest, almost invisible, and yet it gave her something she had never had before, a name on a door that was hers alone. She received a letter each month from Mr. Dorsey, never long, always sealed in red wax. He sent updates on cases she had unknowingly sparked, young women seeking annulments, servants requesting protection, even a baroness who had signed a private petition to allow for the legal preservation of letters from those without station. Clara never asked for credit. She asked only for copies of the verdicts. She kept them in a drawer beside her bed, tied with blue ribbon. In Glenshire Palace, the halls had grown quieter. No announcement had been made, but the portraits had been rearranged. The tapestry of the royal lineage, once prominently displayed near the east stair, was removed for restoration. No one mentioned Clara. No one dared. And yet, in the margins of memory, she had become something more than a scandal. She had become a warning. And, for a few, a hope. It was said among the palace servants that Prince Alaric had begun visiting local hospitals, that he had taken to reading poetry again, that he no longer attended dances, but once paused near the palace stables and stared northward for so long that the groom wondered if he meant to ride away. He never did, not physically. But part of him had left that day in the chapel when the letter was read and the truth bared in public light. The man who remained was quieter, more careful, and on occasion, kind. Years passed. One rainy morning, Clara opened a package wrapped in oilskin and string. Inside, a thin book of poems, anonymously published, finely bound. On the title page, a single line written in a familiar hand. To the one who made silence impossible. No signature. Just the prince's crest, pressed faintly in wax. Clara closed the book without reading it. Not yet. Instead, she opened her window. Rain misted the windowsill, cool and clean. She looked out at the cobblestones, the students, the hurried figures clutching umbrellas, and the children skipping in the puddles. A new world. Not better, but hers. She turned back toward the small room, the drawer of verdicts, the brass placard on the door. And she whispered to herself, not in bitterness or longing, but with simple clarity, "They know my name now." And still, no one dared mention her name again. But every room remembered her,